Hey everybody, this is Beyond Range, and today I'm going to record my full screen. So we're going to see how we might use the random number generator. Now at 200 NL, I would probably not use a random number generator very often because I think it's important when you're playing, you don't want to play too many tables. You really want to see your opponent and try to understand their logic and get better that way. If you're playing so many tables that you need to try to organize a balanced strategy rather than just thinking about why they're doing what they're doing and what makes sense strategically, um, that's fine, but it's not necessarily the most efficient way to go about it if you're really trying to improve. Because if you're using a random number generator, it's because you think you basically cannot have even a 1% edge against their decision, and you don't think you can stay a step ahead of what you think is going on. Um, so here, turn, basically, we're going to end up being very polarized. We're kind of representing stuff like Queen 8, Pocket 8s, and then we're going to have checks. The King 5 suited might not be that efficient because we're getting him to fold weaker spades that we might overflush on the river. So from that perspective, it might not be the best play. But it's also on this particular texture though, I'm not really having that many like bluff raises because it's such a high EV board texture and I don't have that many hands. And then it would be good to organize, some different hands that would make sense and we don't have to waste our flushing outs. So I might be making a little bit of a mistake there using that particular hand. Maybe it's better to organize a range differently. These are some of the things that I could be making mistakes in. And not could be, but you always have to assume that you're making lots of mistakes, but then you're just trying to always get a little bit closer to being accurate. Of course, you're never like perfectly accurate about anything. So it's very important to think in terms of, okay, well, how could I make this range a little bit more efficient, etc. So I think that it's important to reduce the number of tables. Not only do I think that's important, but if you're really trying to get good at poker, playing with a decent amount of depth, and this is very, very tough. I don't think we're going to get 4-bet bluffed all that often from UTG. I think we're getting extremely good pot odds here against a recreational that probably doesn't have that strong of a range, but like given our pot odds nines, I think we can continue. Um, I could basically start talking about what the ranges are doing, how we want to, respond, if we want to have bluffs, what would make sense. But basically, the recreational player has some sort of hand. He's 3-bet, very small. He might have like ace 5 offsuit. He might have king queen. We don't really know what's going on. But we've called pre-flop because we think it's plus EV. And then we've gotten to the flop and it's check through. And now we're on the turn. We decide to check. This guy checks and then we face a bet. So he's kind of just an aggressive. I mean, you don't need to go super deep into notes. You want to be able to just look at the note and have an idea. So what we're going to say, so I'm going to pause this and think about this a little bit. We'll pull up the hand history. Part of the reason why I'm using this format, sharing my entire screen with RNG, is because I want to be able to pause and then pull up hand histories and then talk about these things. Okay, so I've pulled up the hand history, and I don't want to take like 10 minutes on this, but I want to go very quickly and just kind of synthesize what we've seen, right? So, first of all, I'm not going to talk deeply about the recreational player, but I want to say that this is likely sort of rather than talking about the individual hand, we want to take a note that we can use the next time we see it, a very quick synthesized note. So I'm going to write spewy aggro rec. I think that's all. We could write more in detail about his half-pot turn delay on a good card for his range. I don't even know if he's thinking in those terms. And then his river bluff was 3/4, etc. We could write more about that. I think that's absolutely fine. Maybe even that's valuable, but I'm going to keep it like this for now, okay? And I think another interesting part of this hand is that we're three-way here and there's a rec, and we also did not lead the turn. And the UTG player who called the 3-bet did not lead with 2 pair on the queen turn. Now, he could be doing this for a variety of reasons. He could be playing many tables and just think, oh, this queen is really good for in position. He could think that the in position player is crazy and just going to put in too much money. He could be thinking all sorts of stuff. We really don't know what's going on. But I think a note that we want to be aware that he's definitely using strong hands in check call lines at some frequency. So using strong hands in check call lines OP. We already wrote something like this before, but it's just something to note. And then generally when you're taking notes on people and whatnot, you might want to use a color label. Now, there are different labels that you could use, but in poker, rather than saying recreational or professional, I think the important thing is that when you're playing at a deeper level, you're often looking at your particular hand class and you say, well, this hand is going to have trade-offs, and the trade-offs are going to depend on whether or not your opponent is aggressive or your opponent is passive. So for instance, your hand could be betting or your hand could be checking, or your trade-offs could be if you think your opponent is stationy or he's too tight, etc. Then you might want to bluff a weak hand, or you might want to give up with a weak hand. These things are often the way that you might want to color label as opposed to saying recreational, because I think that's too general. Some recreational players are basically just trying to see flops and check everything down unless they have the nuts, and some recreationals are just putting in way too much money. Those are very different strategies. You have to play against these guys completely differently if you want to maximize your EV. So you could even say that this guy is passive, or maybe he's, I mean, maybe this is too little information, but in the future you might label him as passive. And you might label this recreational as aggressive, whichever color label you're going to use. So anyways, we're going to move on to the next one. We'll make red the label for aggressive. Actually, before I had this as strong and just like regular, but it's fine. Because I think it's fine. Red kind of signals, fire or aggression or something like that. Blue sort of signals water or passivity. So before we talk about strategy, yes, on this particular texture, inefficient strategy would be play overbet, let's say, or play 2/3 or whatever. But let's identify our opponent. Our opponent is playing extremely tight. I'm going to go with the check back. Now, one thing you could say is that when there's more money in the pot, and when a 9 comes and you make the nut straight, well, that's really valuable. So already betting this hand on the flop against passive people could have a lot of EV. That's definitely a thing. I don't mind that. But because he's extremely passive, I think there's also other ways to realize this hand, realize EV with this hand, because basically he's probably, a lot of our EV is just coming from folds pre-flop. A lot of the ways that we're making money is by him just clicking fold with something like Jack 10, with something like, or King 8 or whatever. We're using a min sizing, but he's probably way too tight. He's also likely to be betting at some point with a top pair or better hand by the river, but also likely to be checking hands that are total air or king highs or ace highs, etc., and maybe he's not calling them. So you could have some EV in delaying to the river against this player type. Here we have pocket nines. Our opponent is playing 21, 17, 7. 3 betting is absolutely good. Calling is absolutely good. My decision might be more influenced based on who's in the blinds, who I think is over here. Notice as I don't use an RNG and say we're going to do this X percentage of the time. It's a very easy way to not do very well in poker, is to just kind of torch money by using an RNG. You really want to identify which strategic option you want to take. So pre-flop, you have many options. You have the option to call, to 3-bet, and to fold. And against this particular individual, I don't really want to play the fold option. Here we're going to look at the blinds. We're going to go with the call. It looks like we might get squeezed a little bit less often than we should. In addition to that, this guy seems a little bit tighter. On this particular flop, I'm going to play one strategy. I'm not going to start tailoring many different bet sizings and strategies to my opponent. That's actually a fine way to go about it, but I'm going to use one sizing that makes sense with my range. And sevens can basically bet, or it can basically check. Now, I think that in this particular situation against a more passive individual, and by the way, we can go into why we actually want to just use one particular sizing, because really when you're playing, if when you're playing, it's actually decent to tailor your bet sizing for your opponent, especially when you're playing weaker opposition that are not going to be able to counter you. But I think given that this channel is really about the fundamentals and improving, I think that you'd be generally better off trying to understand what sizing your range wants to use on the texture. And if you're playing against someone who's a professional, just sticking with that, but kind of looking at which action your hand wants to take. Let's say we get on a flop, we got on this board texture. We'll pause and we'll talk about this, right? Or let's play the queen 10 first. We can actually use this as an example, right? So queen 10 can go with the bet, and queen 10 can go with the check. Both of these options are fine. So here, we're basically saying, hey, we have an advantage, and we don't need to use even 28% pot, because then we're kind of just giving him a lot of EV with his better hands, but we're sort of, his weaker hands still have roughly the same EV. We're not gaining much by going bigger, because we're basically just trying to make him fold stuff like Jack 9 and, Queen 9 and this kind of weaker stuff, Ace 2. Turn is a situation we're kind of tanking here, but it's one of the more reasonable cards for his range. When we're barreling, we could definitely continue barreling this particular hand. We're tanking a long time because I really want to pause and then look at the trade-offs and explain why we might take a certain action with one of these hands and what the pros and cons are, because you don't want to take you don't want to use your RNG in reality unless you really don't know what's going on. And occasionally the reason why I'm bringing out the RNG is because you might see me use the RNG and you might see that, oh, there's actually a situation that makes sense, right? So first of all, we have the flop. And what's going on here, range versus range, is we're raising min, very small pre-flop. Because there are 3 people left to act after we RFI, we cannot raise like 80% of hands. What's going to happen is we're going to have sort of a range that's roughly 30%. It's based on the math. Now, if people are like playing too tight behind us, then we can go to like 32, 33. If they're insanely bad and will never adjust, you could even go to like 40. But generally, when you're playing 200 NL online, people are not that weak. And when you have statistics like that, people will really start 3-betting you a lot, and then your weaker hands get torched, so you don't want to be that loose anyways. Sometimes you have a big blind player, so in one hand you say, I'm going to open like really wide, like I'm going to open, King 7 offsuit, because the big blind, I'm just going to destroy him. And then the other people don't really know what you're doing. But you're not just opening 70% of hands or 40% of hands every single time. That's a little bit different. But the point is that we're raising about 30% of hands, and the big blind is calling, and his range is going to be pretty weak, right? He's 3-betting stuff like aces, kings, queens, jacks, and he's going to end up calling a lot of like Broadway stuff, a lot of suited stuff, but overall our range is concentrated more toward high equity hands. However, we're not going to be raising stuff like Jack 4 suited. We're not going to be raising hands like 7-4 suited, 6-4 suited, right? Queen 4 suited. However, he ends up having a lot of these. So in No Limit, even though we have an equity advantage, because of the fact that he has so many nut hands, when he has his nut hands, he wants to try to put a lot of money in the pot, because when money goes in, he's going to have money with an advantage, right? If he has 90% equity, well, he wants the pot to get bigger. Now, as the pot gets bigger, in position starts folding more against raises, and then his average equity starts to decrease. So there's sort of a fine line with how aggressive he can raise. For instance, if he's hit a 7 and we're betting a lot of our hands on the flop, well, yeah, 7 is going to be ahead of a lot of our range. But if he puts money in too frequently, then there are some consequences for turn play. There are consequences for his actual composition on flop raise, etc. But the point is that he's going to be able to leverage this nut advantage. Now, a hand like Queen 10, this is the key, right? We're talking about betting versus checking. Okay, this is the thing. Now, you need to be able to consider, you're not just looking at one isolated variable, but you need to be able to consider when you're betting, you're thinking about his response against bet. You're also comparing that to his response after you check the flop and then you have a turn. And not only a turn, but maybe he checks the turn, but then maybe he gets to a river. Or maybe he bets the turn, but then maybe you continue, or maybe you raise, and then maybe he way overfolds. You have to think about all these different nodes that are happening and think about where you're going to make the most money. Now, it's very hard to think about all those things simultaneously, so we tend to try to simplify it, which is what I do as well. So you can think about, is the big blind going to leverage his nut advantage aggressively, right? Is he going to raise enough and then also put in enough money with bluffs on turn, river, etc.? And is he actually going to be over slow playing? Let's say if he's over slow playing 4x, then you actually can get away with a lot more bets on the flop because he's not going to raise you. So you can get away with a lot more protection bets. There's so many things happening, but you kind of but you need to think about the variables. If you're using an RNG but you're not thinking about this, then you're basically not playing poker. You're just gambling with a random number generator, and you're making yourself feel safe that you know what you're doing, but you really don't. And I'm not saying this in an attacking way or an insulting way. I'm saying this very factually, purely cold factually, that when you're in these decision points, you want to try to identify how your opponent is playing. And if you think that, let's say, he over check raises the flop with bluffs, but then you say that on turn he ends up giving up too much, maybe that gives you a decent amount of EV for betting the flop with queen 10, right? And maybe when he raises, maybe you call and try to bluff him later. That's one pathway that it could go down. But let's say his raise frequency is 15%. So let's say that you bet this hand 100% of the time, and let's say 50% he folds, or let's say 30% he folds. Let's say 35% he folds, okay? And then let's say 30%. I mean, I'm getting a little bit abstract. I don't want to talk about this too much, but I think you guys get the point. Is that you're also going to get into the node where he check calls the flop, right? And then when you're on the turn, and let's say you have the clubs, you have to realize, oh, well, you have clubs, and maybe there's a particular turn where the card is really good for you. Maybe there's like a queen, or maybe there's a jack, or maybe there's a 10. Right? How is he going to respond on these turns? How valuable is having a queen in this spot? Right? How valuable is it to bet min when he's just going to continue king, queen, queen, jack, you know, and maybe he's folding like queen 9, queen 8, queen 5, and now you're not dominating that. Like, is this the most efficient queen to bet? You have so many variables to think about, infinite things. So you really don't, you'd rather just use your own intelligence and logic than using an RNG. And if you're playing too many tables to think about that, well, I don't know what to say. I can understand if you need to pay your rent, so you have to survive, but poker is a weird thing where the bigger you jump up in stakes, the more money you're able to make. And really, the recreational players at 10 and L compared to 200, compared to 2,000, are often very similar. Now, maybe when you move up in stakes, they start playing a little bit differently, but the bigger stakes you play, the less rake there is. And of course, on average, your opposition in terms of professionals will have a higher skill level the bigger the big blind is, but still, it's very important to work on these skills. It's very important to not be caught in the trap of, I'm going to use an RNG and then I'm safe, because that's really not playing poker. Here we have the Queen 8 offsuit. We're playing against Please No Thank You. He's tanking on the button. Now, there are a number of things that we can do here. He tanked really long. Now, he could basically exploit me by tanking a long time. And, I'm basically doing a very, very exploitative thing here because of his extremely long tank. He could be intentionally tanking a very long time with a strong hand, and then, hoping that people will 3-bet him more often, whatever the case is. But I think that when he's tanking that long, it's much more likely that he's thinking about a decision on another table, that he has some action that he has to do, because this guy is generally for tabling, right? And he's a very intelligent player. He's a very good player. This individual is probably not trying to do very many reverse timing tells, given that he's playing so many tables. When he's tanking so long, as a human being, when you see aces, you're naturally immediately trying to put your attention there, and you don't want to time out, and you don't always know, you're not always conscious of how many time banks you have, so you're much more likely to click raise with a hand like aces. But then when you have a weaker hand like Queen 8, your attention is still more likely to be in the other pot on your other table, where let's say you have a flush draw or you're facing a river bet. Now, when you end up moving up to higher games where people are playing less tables, these timing tells you really don't want to use. These timing tells you could use a little bit more at Zoom, and you could try to attack some of these kind of things. But also, please note that now this hand was not particularly good. And then, from the perspective of information hiding, he might see that, oh, we're raising this hand and we're trying to mess with him because of timing. But we're using a sort of exploit. And I don't normally like to talk about these on my videos, but it's a really good example. And he used to be a nosebleed player. He's extremely talented. He's definitely the best 200 cash and rush player in this pool. And that makes me think that he's a little bit less deceptive than a lot of maybe some other 200 NL players, and that might sound counterintuitive. You might assume that the stronger they are, the more deceptive they are. But actually, really deception is used when you have incentive to be deceptive. But because he's playing against people that are at 200 NL, it's very likely, in my opinion, that he's quite straightforward in many different situations. And also, he's going to be playing the individual as well. He's not going to be playing the aggregate. He's going to be playing me in each moment. And the more hands that he plays against me, the more he'll model me. He's not just trying to play a population. He's much better than that. And as you start to play poker at a higher level, that's kind of the way that you're looking at poker as well. Here again, we do have someone that might be weaker. We don't really know. Actually, it's too short of a sample to know, and I really have not played with this individual. And his screen name leads me to believe that he's maybe a professional, actually. And his country might also be professional, because we really don't know. But maybe he's more likely to be a professional when he's saying L never fold. So, interesting spot. Now, this is a spot on the ace-10-9. I'm just going to talk about the theory. I won't really talk too much about like what actually makes sense in terms of barrel frequency and what he has incentive to raise with in terms of bluffs and whatnot, because I think maybe I'm kind of giving too much away, and I do have to protect myself. But it's important to think about the theory here. What's happening? We're basically saying, hey, we're three betting, and we have this region of ace king, ace queen, and we're kind of going to leverage our equity advantage. And he's saying, hey, yeah, well, that's great, but when I call, your range is weak, and then you're just not going to barrel very often, so I'm forced to basically raise a lot of my decent hands in order to actually get EV with my range. That's the theory. Now, in practice, someone might be more likely to raise their nuts if they think that you're not putting in enough money in later nodes after you c-bet and they call. Or the opposite, they might over slow play if they think that you're putting in too much money after they c-bet and then you call. Here, River, basically he's ended up raising the flop. The turn has gone check, check. And now we're on the river. He should be playing a fair amount of slow plays here with hands like pocket tens, with hands like ace 10, pocket nines, etc. He will also have ace queen and ace jack in this line occasionally. And fives is not really much of a thing in this particular spot. This is a little bit aggressive. He could also think that we're just way over folding. But the problem is that on ace 10, or sorry, on ace 10-9, in positions range may not have that many folds. This is kind of, I'm also going to pause and just think. We're going to talk about sort of his logic and break down what we think he's doing and why he might be doing that and how we might exploit that a little bit. So we have to get the hand history 1 second. Okay, so I've taken like 5 minutes now to think about this, and I'm going to pause this and think about it more because I think there's so many different parts of this hand that are so valuable for this video. So I'm going to take a little bit of time and we're going to talk about this from many different perspectives because I think this might be the most revealing hand and the most important hand that we've played in any session thus far on the channel. So I'm going to go in more depth and bear with me, but this is where the value comes from. The value is not coming from talking about a flop c-bet. Poker is really about understanding people's logic and why they do what they do and then being able to predict their future decisions with a high amount of accuracy. That's why it looks like when people are having 5 or 7 big blind win rates at high stakes against the best in the world, it's like, well, it's hard to do that at low stakes. How is that happening at high stakes? Well, it's because they're thinking about other people's logic and they're able to stay many steps ahead. So we're going to kind of discuss this and go in as much depth as possible. Okay, I'm back, and I took a while, but I'm still a little bit confused as to like the best way to talk about this, but please be patient with me because I am ignorant, but I still am going to try to talk about this as best as I can. So I want to take this apart from first principles because there's like so much happening here. First of all, when you look at the hand history, it might on the surface appear that this is a simple bluff from this guy that failed. But if you zoom out a little bit, you start to see that the line reveals a lot about how he actually thinks about the game. And that's extremely valuable because once you understand someone's model of how poker works, it's much easier to predict their future decisions much more accurately. So the goal isn't to say this bluff didn't work. The goal is to understand the logic behind the line and basically what it tells us about this player's strategic framework. So let's kind of reconstruct this hand. Now, basically, we opened sorry, he opened and then we were on the button and we three bet. And he called a three bet. He's UTG and we're on the button, right? So UTG being out of position in this spot against the button is going to be a pretty difficult situation already. Because basically button's range is stronger and the button also has a positional advantage. So structurally, very tough spot for him. So any aggressive action from UTG has to come from both a range disadvantage and from a positional disadvantage. And when you end up getting the flop of ace 10 9, he ends up check raising pretty small, which is super weird. It doesn't really make any sense because this is not mathematically correct in terms of theory. Because basically, when you think about poker mathematically, when you have a check raise in this spot, the check raises are not going to deny equity, right? It's not like the board is like 8-5-2 where you have pocket jacks and you're trying to deny equity against a range that's betting too often with too many overcards. On the ace 10-9, actually what's happening is that out of position is forced to kind of play a polarized strategy. Now there's more going on than that because out of position is going to fold so much on the flop because of the huge equity advantage for in position that then they start raising more ace-x, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't matter because the main point is they're nuts. That's the portion of their range that they're constructing for. And that's where the sizing is going to come from, is for their nuts. So it means that when they end up using a sizing, they want to use a polarized sizing, like a big sizing. And that means that they either are going to have very strong value hands like sets, two pairs, and occasionally they can stick in some ace king, ace queen, but that's not the main part, or like strong draws, or whatever kind of bluffs they would use that they think makes sense, right? So when these ranges are polarized, they naturally want to use big sizes because the larger bets accomplish two things simultaneously. They basically increase the chance that the bluff succeeds because your opponent is supposed to fold more, which that's kind of like putting the carriage before the horse. But the main point is that they force more money into the pot when you actually are ahead, right? So what our opponent did was he used a small check raise sizing, which really does not accomplish either of those goals whatsoever. It's very inefficient. It doesn't apply the same pressure to the medium strength hands of in position, right? And it doesn't build a pot for getting the maximum value when you end up having this nutted region. So you're kind of just donating free money to your opponent when you don't get the sizings correct. So right away we see that our opponent isn't really structuring a classic polarized strategy for his check raise. Instead, a raise looks more kind of like in chess you might see a player that's moving the game into a certain part of the tree that's not theoretically correct, but it's more like a tactical maneuver. They're trying to like out trick you or they're trying to trap you, but it doesn't really make sense theoretically. And this is the same thing in this particular situation. We're seeing a tactical maneuver, something to create discomfort somewhere, and he's trying to exploit that. In this particular situation, he's trying to create discomfort in the moment with in position's middling region rather than designing the entire shape of the hand, thinking about the big picture. And this brings us to a concept that you think a lot about in chess and poker, which is lower stakes people often are thinking in terms of like things in the hand, or you could call it like local thinking compared to global thinking, right? Local thinking means that you're evaluating each decision in isolation. Like I'm on the flop and I think he's going to fold too much to a raise, or I think he's going to fold too much, but then later he's going to, or maybe he's going to call too much, but then later he's going to fold. My line looks strong. I'm just going to go crazy, right? Now, the player looks at the current street and asks something like, okay, well, what might fold now? right, or whatever. Now, global thinking means evaluating the entire structure of the hand and asking, what will my range look like by the river if I take this line, and what's the most efficient sizing to use to maximize the EV of my range? Now, the small raise basically strongly suggests local thinking, right? It's a move aimed at attacking the middling region of our range. Stuff like King Queen, King Jack, Queen Jack, Pocket Jacks, King 10, 8 9, all this kind of stuff, And it doesn't really set up the rest of the hand. That's the problem. That's the issue. And you don't want to generally play poker like this because when you start playing tougher opposition, it becomes very easy to win because you're just playing dominated strategies. Now, when we move to the turn pairs the ace. And UTG leads about half pot, which makes absolutely zero sense whatsoever. Again, the sizing is super weird. Because if UTG is actually playing a polarized range, which are basically ace 10, pocket 10s, pocket 9s, etc., various bluffs, the turn would actually be, it would make the most sense to apply maximum pressure, right? It would make sense to start overbetting the turn or using a roughly geometric sizing in this particular situation. In theory, this is often the kind of spot where players are using very large bets because, again, it maximizes the EV of the range that you're betting. And it takes the most amount away from your opponent's range. Okay, because the range that you're betting is going to have very strong hands, and in order for your opponent to make you indifferent to bluffing, he's going to be forced to put money in with bluff catchers. So this is just the math. In later videos, I might talk about the math. If people have questions and they aren't familiar, I can do a lot of theory videos on the math. I'm assuming that most people that are thinking about playing mid-stakes, they already understand this kind of stuff. But I'm also happy to make them because I think it's important no matter what. But yes, you want to be using big sizings. Now, our opponent bets half pot, and this size does not force any difficult decisions. It doesn't even accomplish much of anything. It doesn't create the kind of pot geometry that actually supports a powerful river shove. So he's not going to be able to get much EV with his nuts, which is basically what you're trying to accomplish in this particular spot, because you're not just trying to raise with ace jack, with ace queen, with random stuff like that, or do a little trick with small sizing with something like queen jack or whatever. It just doesn't, it's not a very efficient sizing. So then the question is, why would someone do something like this, right? So we know that it's not efficient. We know that it's not theoretically a good strategy. Okay, and it's often because they're not thinking about the global structure of the hand. They're thinking about how the bet looks. Many players intuitively believe that if a line appears strong, they should reduce their bet sizing to make it more believable or to avoid scaring their opponent away. But actually, this intuition is completely backwards, and it doesn't actually do well when you start playing tougher opposition because you're just not able to get as much money with your range when you're supposed to. It's actually kind of really backwards. So if your line already looks strong, that's exactly when large bets actually are effective in reality, because the strength of the narified amplifies the psychological pressure created by the bet sizing. Okay? And that doesn't really matter because we're still putting the carriage before the horse, because we're still talking about it in terms of how it looks. Whereas really what you have are equities and shifts in equities and how much your hand wants to put in and how you want to construct a range across multiple streets. Now, but still psychologically, it's still kind of a pitfall, and it's actually illogical. Now, if a player believes that their opponent folds too much against large bets, the logical adjustment is not to bet smaller, it's to bluff more often with that same sizing that's good for your range, right? That's what's actually the logical thing to do. So again, we see the opponent was operating from a very local perspective rather than a global one. So he's like, I'm going to bet half pot on the turn. Now we end up getting to the river, and the river completes some draws, right? Queen Jack gets there, which is actually a very frequent hand. I don't think that King Jack or King Queen necessarily raise the flop all that often, and when they do, they might give up the turn. And when they end up betting the turn, it's like, come on, everything gets there. Are you not going to bluff? Like, what bluffs do you have? Do you think that like Ace King for in position is going to be happy to call like 180% pot shove? Like, it's really scary. I mean, even though this shouldn't have occurred in this way. But The point is that everything basically gets there on the river. And he ends up giving up. He ends up basically checking and giving up, even though everything gets there. So this is basically the most interesting part of the hand, because if you take a step back and you look at the whole line, UTG opened, and then he's only at 17%, right? And then the button 3 bets, and then UTG has to just fold a lot. So UTG is calling a pretty decent, strong range here. And then the button is not able to just bet everything. He kind of has to bet some decent hands here. And he still can bet a lot, but not everything. So his range is strengthened compared to just his overall get to flop range. And then UTG raises and in position calls a raise. Okay? And then on the turn, the ace comes and UTG bets turn again and in position calls a turn bet, right? So UTG is telling a story like, hey, my range is ridiculously strong. I know you have all these like trip aces. Like, what are you going to do? I've got ace 10. I've got pocket nines. I've got pocket tens. Now even my queen jack completes. Are you going to call me down with your ace king, right? And if you really think about this, a large river bet, like basically an overbet shove, probably makes the most sense, or maybe something like that, because you don't want your opponent to repolarize against you. Then that kind of hurts whatever value hands you have, and you want to be able to get the max with your nuts. So in this spot, it makes a lot of sense to use a shove if you're setting up the spot correctly, and also you could use a little bit smaller of a sizing with something like queen jack. It's super weird though because of the way that like he bet the turn in position's range after he has to call a half pot bet is like very, very different. But the point is that you probably just want to shove the river, right? So why doesn't this guy, when everything completes, like go all in? It's super weird that when everything completes he just gives up. And it's because he's basically thinking in terms of like a local node of the game tree. He's evaluating the river on its own. Like, the button's range looks too strong and now bluffing feels very dangerous. But he doesn't really fully appreciate that his own line has already created an extremely powerful narrative. Like, it looks like he has the nuts. And it looks like in position is really strong, right? And this is one of the subtle skill gaps that separates people at like mid stakes from high stakes. It's very important, and this is why you should not play many tables. You should always go in more depth and try to constantly try to figure out what's actually happening. Because intermediate players learn to attack weakness when they recognize that their opponent's range is kind of full of medium stuff. But elite players are trying to manipulate narratives basically across multiple streets, right? They're thinking about the line, they're thinking about the story. They understand that sometimes the line itself becomes so threatening that it creates an opportunity to apply enormous pressure, even if the bluff frequency is theoretically quite low. Maybe they end up over bluffing because it looks so powerful. And this hand sits basically right there where it tells you, well, he's not thinking like that, right? He's obviously giving up this river. You could also go a step further if there's a doubt that's like, oh, well, he just thinks your range is too strong, but not really. I mean, yeah, he does think your range is too strong, but he's not thinking about his line. I think that a lot of people at 200 Zoom, when they get here with Ace King or Ace Queen on the river and the guy goes all in, they're folding a lot because their hand is a pure bluff catcher and their range looks really strong. It's very easy to fold trip ace king or trip ace queen on the river because your range looks like you have this, and most people at this stake are facing opponents who are bluffing based on how their range looks, or they're having the other part of their range which is strong and they're just betting it regardless. They're just trying to get money with their hand. So the opponent here understands that aggression obviously is good to use because he's raising pocket fives on ace 10 9, but then he's applying basically flop and turn pressure. Even the turn is super interesting, the fact that he continues betting, but he doesn't fully understand how this sequence of actions actually shapes the perception of his range on the river, because even queen jack gets there. I mean, even 7-6, which isn't really much of a thing, but even that gets there. Like, everything, it's really hard to not have a hand here in this situation. So basically he's never going to be able to reach his full potential for making EV if he just randomly gives up and isn't thinking so deeply about like what is the opponent actually going to play. He just says, "Oh, opponent's range this, therefore I cannot bluff anymore." But people fold really big hands when they think they're strong and when the narrative is strong, and it says a lot about basically his ceiling or where how he's thinking about the game. I don't want to keep talking because I've talked about this for like 15 minutes now. But once you start thinking about poker at this level, ranges and pot geometry and the story that you tell, the logic behind the bet sizing, everything becomes much more clear. And you start to see why certain lines feel awkward, or you could say they even feel incomplete, even when they seem aggressive on the surface. And this is a very good example. And this is a very good example of probably someone that's doing okay at 200, but probably would have a very difficult time at 500 or 1K. And maybe even he would have an okay time there, but it might be harder when he ends up trying to move up as well. And we could also talk about how you don't really want to use tricks when you're playing at all with the bet sizing. I mean, we already talked about earlier in this episode, we talked about how it makes more logical sense when you're playing against regulars to use the sizing that makes sense for your range. Don't just try to trick people. Now, before we end, I just want to say one thing because it's important as well, because it reveals another thing that I think we can reflect on for ourselves. Again, we zoom out. And this is one of the most important lessons from this hand was not actually about, specific bluffs or specific sizes. That has nothing to do with why we talked about this hand. So I'm kind of going to actually summarize what I was saying. So basically, it's about how you think about poker decisions in the first place. Because many poker players approach the game from the perspective of individual hands. They look at their cards, they look at the board, and then they ask, well, what should I do with this hand to win the pot? From that perspective, a lot of strange bet sizes and tactical maneuvers start to feel reasonable. Maybe a small check raise looks tricky, or maybe a half pot bet on the turn might feel like they're going to push someone off their draw. Maybe a strange size might confuse the opponent. But this is a very hand-centric way to think about things. But the moment you start to play stronger opponents, that style of thinking becomes extremely apparent. And one might ask why. The reason why is because you make decisions based off of what your specific hands are going to want. Your intentions leak through your actions. The bet sizes, the timings, and basically they all start to correspond directly to the purpose of the hand that you have. And a strong player is able to see a pattern pretty quickly if you're good at poker. And they realize this person is not playing a structured range strategy. They're trying to accomplish something with the hand they have right now. And once that realization happens, your play becomes extremely easy to read. Now imagine a poker player at the level of playing hands might not realize how easy it is to read. So let me give you an analogy, right? Imagine that you're playing a game of chess, okay? Or imagine a chess game. Let's take ourselves out of it. Let's think about a chess game. And a beginner chess player often plays the move that looks clever on the surface, right? They might threaten a piece by making some surprising move, or they try to use some small tactical trick that could basically win material if their opponent's not paying attention, like winning this immediately, winning that, right? Now against another beginner, that trick might work, and in poker the same thing is the case. If you're playing mid stakes or you're playing low stakes, some tricks might work initially. But when you're playing a grandmaster, which of course the goal of poker is to get better, so you never want to limit your ceiling because you've already learned the game in a certain way. You never want to limit your potential. You always want to think about poker as you're going to be the best that you can possibly be. You don't need to compare yourself, but you want to be as good as you possibly can be. And I guarantee you can be good because you're already playing poker, right? Most people that are intelligent are interested in intellectual pursuits, and poker happens to be one of them, right? So think about this. If you're playing a beginner, this trick might work, but when you're playing against a grandmaster, When they see this move, their reaction is going to be very different. The grandmaster is not thinking about the individual threat, oh, he's going to try and take my pawn or whatever. They're looking at the actual structure of the position. And they immediately see that this move does not fit with the long-term logic of the board. It's a trick. It's not a plan, right? And because it's a trick, the grandmaster understands that the opponent is trying to accomplish something. And that something, as you see millions of hands at poker, as you start to, you don't even need to see millions, you just need to understand logic better. It's not hard to reverse engineer what the thought process is that leads to that. Just like we reverse engineered this guy's thought process and broke it down. And it will be much easier to basically predict how he's going to play in future situations. When you size your bets according to what your hand wants, better players can often figure out what you're thinking about and how you're doing it. They can see that a small raise is meant to push out medium hands. They can see that a cautious turn bet is meant to look believable, but you're still scared of running into too many good hands. They see that a bluff stops when the board becomes scary, even though everything gets there. And even though your line is so credible, but it's scary for you to bluff because you think that your opponent has too many trips or houses or straights, so you can't follow through. The logic is very easy to figure out, and it's not like this one hand. Most of your money in poker is made on the river, right? And it's not like it's made, but the difference between your opponent's decisions and your decisions are going to be exaggerated compared to all the other spots, right? And when you figure out people's logic, you can really, really own them with very high win rates. Right? So you don't want people to understand your logic. That's extremely dangerous. Now, range-based play means that your actions are determined not by the immediate desires of your hands, but by the needs of your entire distribution of hands that you could have in that spot. The size you choose is going to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The same large bet sizing, if you end up overbetting the turn, will contain strong hands, draws, bluffs. The same check also might hide weakness and strength, rather than just using this medium inefficient sizing. From the outside, the line becomes much harder to interpret if you're playing in a way that structurally makes sense. This is why strong players often say something strange at first. Sometimes you make a play that feels wrong for your specific hand because it's correct for your range. And that shift from hand-centric thinking to thinking range-centrically, or to range-centric thinking, however you put it, I'm not sure, is basically one of the biggest conceptual leaps in poker, which helps people move out of going from 10 NL, 25 NL, 50 NL, 100 NL, etc. But you start to be able to move past that, past 200 NL, where they're just still using tricks. 500 NL, where they're still just using tricks. Now, it's very similar to the difference between improvising hands individually or moves individually and following a more coherent set of logic or system, but not like a system that you memorize, but you understand how the game works. And you can see the difference everywhere in life because, for instance, in business, inexperienced managers often react to each individual or each problem individually, right? They patch an issue as if it's done here, or they make decisions that feel sensible in the moment, but because those decisions are basically local fixes, they don't align with the overall big picture strategy that they're trying to accomplish. Over time, the organization maybe becomes too predictable or too chaotic to their competitors. And experienced leaders do the opposite. They design systems and principles that guide decisions consistently. Individual actions might look strange in isolation, but they make sense within the larger framework. And poker works in the same way. When you rely on tactics or hand-driven sizes, you are constantly improvising because each street becomes its own little battle. You're reacting to the moment rather than executing a plan. But when you think in terms of ranges, you're building a structure that spans the entire hand. The sizes that you use on the flop is already anticipating what the turn in the river going to look like. Your strategy remains coherent even when individual hands can vary or they feel uncomfortable for some but they feel great for others, etc. And it's very important because that prevents your opponent from easily understanding your logic and what you're trying to accomplish. This is why trick-based strategies often fail against tougher opponents, because tricks reveal intent. They tell the opponent exactly which part of their range you're trying to attack. Range-based strategies conceal intent. They force the opponent to defend against an entire distribution of possibilities. And in the hand we were analyzing, the opponent's small check raise on the flop and moderate turn bet, you could say half pot turn bet, is really small. Suggests that he's thinking about the immediate tactical goal. He's trying to push out certain medium strength hands like pocket kings, queens, jacks, 10x, straight draws, etc., rather than constructing a line that represents a coherent range that maximizes the EV of his strategy. Now, a stronger player, by contrast, would actually think about the entire range and how it should behave. And the bet sizings would emerge naturally from that structure. So, the big picture is that poker becomes much harder for your opponents to play against, or poker becomes harder for your opponents when you're playing in a way that mathematically makes sense, when your decisions are guided by the needs of your own range instead of the desires of your individual hands. Because once you start thinking about what your range needs, your opponents are going to be forced to play well. Anyways, this is beyond range. This was a long explanation, but I think it's important. And I think this is the point of the channel. This was very interesting hand. So I love you guys and thank you for being with me, and we'll see you next time.